Bitcoin mining is everything that people don't know about computers, combined with everything they don't know about money, combined with everything they don't understand about energy. Everyone who has an informed opinion about Bitcoin mining is telling us exactly the same thing, which is that it is critical, and this will be brain scrambling to a lot of people, but it is absolutely critical to the green energy transition. If you build that facility and you try and get a return on investment without Bitcoin mining, just over 8 years. If you do it with Bitcoin mining as a customer, 3.7 years. It's a huge difference. Bitcoin mining data centers are the single most flexible user of electricity we have ever had. And that has tremendous advantages to the grid operator. It's the thing you actually want more of, not less of.
Daniel Batten is a climate tech investor, Bitcoin mining analyst, and former tech CEO known for his sharp, data-backed advocacy of Bitcoin's role in climate solutions.
As founder of Genius, he helped shape New Zealand's tech scene and now bridges the worlds of sustainability, Bitcoin, and finance.
I think certainly we're past peak FUD when it comes to Bitcoin and energy. We now have, out of the last 25 papers, in fact 26 now as of last week, 21 of them have concluded that there are positive environmental benefits to Bitcoin mining. Of those 21 papers, only 2 of them had any affiliation with Bitcoin mining industry. So the other 19 had zero affiliation. Bitcoin solves a lot of problems that are not seen in the West. Very often I hear people say, well, Bitcoin doesn't have a use case. Now, unfortunately, that's more a statement about the person saying it than it is about Bitcoin.
Hey guys, welcome back to Less Noise, More Signal. Today, I'm sure we're covering a lot of signal on the show because we have Daniel Batten with us. It's great to have you with us, Daniel.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we were just joking. I can actually say this. We started and I said, we're covering a lot of noise, but actually, no, it's the opposite.
We're counteracting a lot of noise. Yeah.
Yeah. There is a lot of noise, though, when it comes
Absolutely.
to the topics that I want to talk to you about. I mean, it's the whole energy debate and in general, like the social impact of Bitcoin. A lot of people are still struggling with this because they're hanging on to these old beliefs that they've heard covered through media or somewhere else. Like their typical professor at the university might have told them about it. So it's definitely great to have you on to dissect some of this and then also dispel some of the myths that are still floating around. So cool to have you on. Could you maybe quickly introduce yourself? I think I read that you're today sort of a climate tech investor, but maybe you have a different background, I assume. So it'd be nice to know where you're coming from.
So my background is I ran technology companies and was fortunate enough to be part of 3 different teams over a 10-year period, all of which exited, not just due to myself, but due to really having a great team. And I think a little bit of luck as well. When I left New Zealand, I joined a company which turned out to be an internet startup company. I didn't even know there was such a thing then. That was back in the mid to late 90s. And then founded my own company in 2003. We exited several years ago. And I spent the last period of time investing in other technology companies. I've been an angel investor for about 15 years. But 5 years ago, I started 2 funds. And our focus was basically ESG. That wasn't a term back 5 years ago, but that's exactly what we were doing. So we're doing climate tech investing and also investing which has high social value. And around 3 years ago, it was actually one of the investors into our fund that I was in a conversation with. And he said, well, what are you doing right now? We were at a cafe. We were waiting for his wife to come who wanted to meet and chat about the fund performance as well. And I said, well, I'm actually researching Bitcoin mining. And it was interesting because his whole body language changed. And remember, this is 2022. The narrative was very different back in those days to what it is now. His whole body language changed completely. It stiffened. He folded his arms. He said, I thought you were interested in impact investment or words to that effect. And I said, well, it sounds like you've got some beliefs about Bitcoin mining. Let's hear them. And I did. And of course, I've been researching it. You've got to remember, I'm an investor. So I approach things from the point of view of doing due diligence on a technology before you reach a conclusion, which means you are in the habit of being skeptical. And so I'd been very skeptical about the claims that Bitcoin was good for the environment that I'd heard from Bitcoiners, but I'd also been skeptical of the claims that it was bad for the environment that I'd read in the media. So I disbelieved everything. and really went back to first principles and looked at it as a climate tech technology through the lens of someone who invests in these technologies and has seen over 200 different climate tech propositions over a period of 10 years. Anyway, by the end of our conversation, he said, well, this actually sounds really positive. Have you considered your next fund being a Bitcoin mining investment fund? And I hadn't at that point, but I thought, you know what, that's actually not a bad idea. And that really started the path of me becoming very interested in the intersection between not just Bitcoin is not harmful for the environment, but how can you use Bitcoin as an ESG asset in such a way that it's net positive for the environment as well as net positive in terms of its returns.
This show is brought to you by NewHedge. In a market driven by complexity, insight is everything. NewHedge is a dedicated Bitcoin analytics and intelligence platform delivering cutting-edge analysis, on-chain metrics, and real-time market data. With 200 plus proprietary indicators, live derivatives data, and adoption metrics, NewHedge provides the depth and precision that serious market participants demand. Backed by some of Bitcoin's most prolific investors, NewHedge connects traditional finance with Bitcoin's evolving landscape. Gain your data edge today. Sign up for free now at newhedge.io and get 50% off your advanced subscription with the code SIGNAL. What if you could lower your tax bill and stack Bitcoin at the same time? Well, by mining Bitcoin with Blockware, you can. New tax guidelines from the Big Beautiful Bill allow American miners to write off 100% of the cost of their mining hardware in a single tax year. That's right, a 100% write-off. If you have $100,000 in capital gains or income, you can purchase $100,000 worth of miners and offset it entirely. Blockware's mining as a service solution enables you to start mining Bitcoin right now without lifting a finger. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. You get to stack Bitcoin at a discount every single day, while also saving big time when tax season hits. Get started today by going to mining.blockwaresolutions.com/LNMS. Again, that's mining.blockwaresolutions.com/LNMS. Oh, that's actually quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, to your point, a climate tech investor, it's probably not your typical guy that would really talk about Bitcoin and then even maybe in a positive light, because that's what I'm experiencing myself.
Well, I was, okay, to start with, I really was. And I'll be honest, I was probably too charitable with myself before, because my first reaction was not particularly balanced. It was not objective. It was subjective. It was emotional. I did get sucked into a lot of the narratives that I was reading in the media at the time. And it was really only once I was challenged by actually the CEO of one of our investee companies who was into Bitcoin and also an environmentalist. He'd founded a company which helped to make greenhouses carbon neutral by weaning them off a steady supply of natural gas and weaning them onto biofuel, so carbon neutral. And when he started to say, well, would you form your opinions as an investor through reading the media? I was like, no, of course not. You rely on institutional grade alpha. He said, well, why would you form your opinion on a technology from reading the media? I said, actually, that's a really good point. He said, yeah, shouldn't you actually speak to people who really know what they're talking about, who have done the research, who aren't just journalists or even general energy, quote unquote, experts, but have specific knowledge at the intersection of climate, tech, Bitcoin mining, energy, and grids. And I was like, good point. So I started to speak to those people. And once I started to speak to those people who really had a good fundamental energy literacy, understood Bitcoin mining, and also understood climate technology, I started to get some very different answers to what I was.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think from the outside, being really a rookie and a layman when it comes to these topics, but I feel like that's also, to be fair with some of the critics. I mean, as you said, some of them inform themselves, just go through reading through the media, and that's really not the right approach and not a really credible approach. But at the same time, to give them some credit, it's also a very hard topic. Bitcoin itself is quite still
Incredible.
technical, and then energy as well. And so the mixture of everything, it is quite tough to see through
Very tough.
through it.
Yeah, I was saying to someone before, they asked for my definition of Bitcoin mining, and I said, Bitcoin mining is everything that people don't know about computers, combined with everything they don't know about money, combined with everything they don't understand about energy. Right. So
Exactly.
generally
Yeah.
speaking, in the population, we don't have good money literacy. We might have good financial literacy, but not money literacy, not good understanding of what is money, how is it created, what is debasement, what is sound money versus non-sound money. Most people don't have any good understanding of that, including people who work in the financial sector. And then when we look at computers, again, people don't have a good understanding of computers. And journalists in particular, we've seen this pattern where people's predictions of computers have failed to take into account Moore's law, for example. We've seen in generations gone by outlandish predictions about the energy usage of the internet, which was written by people who didn't understand Moore's law, that computers are getting more efficient over time. And then energy is another area where people just don't have good literacy, myself included. For me, look, electricity to me until 3 years ago was something that happened when you switched on a light. That was it. And I had no understanding of what was required behind the scenes to deliver that electricity. The issues and problems that a grid operator has to balance supply and demand constantly, and the fact that you live in a wired world, not a wireless world, like we're communicating wirelessly right at the moment. We can send data packets, we can send sound bites, we can send visual signals wirelessly. We can't do that with energy. I can't say, hey, I want to send you 3 kilowatt hours worth of energy from Costa Rica to Switzerland. Can't do that. You need wires to transmit it. And so the more you understand energy, the more Bitcoin mining starts to make sense as well. But how do you understand energy without having to understand the nuances of flexible load consumption, demand response, and all the other acronyms you suddenly get into the moment you unpack that? So part of my job is not only being to understand it for myself, but then to ask myself the question, how do I relate this information to other people such that they don't have to go through that very long rabbit hole that I went through? So that's been part of
Yeah.
my work as well, is to make it digestible to people who had the same amount of energy understanding and electricity understanding that I did 3 years ago.
No, I think, and that's also very much appreciated by the entire community, and that's why the things that you're saying are received so well. Because, like, it is typical of Bitcoin to have these rabbit hole routes. Like money is a rabbit hole, and then the whole energy topic is another rabbit hole. I assume, as you say, when some people, me included, hear all these acronyms that you just dropped, it's like, wow, really overwhelming. And
It
so
is.
they feel really
And
grateful
you
for
turn out
people.
pretty fast. You think, well, you know what, that sounds hard. I'll leave that for another day, and that another day never comes. And so I think for a lot of people, what happens is they'll read something in the media, they might hear a contrary narrative, but it might be very technical in nature, and they're left not with certainty, but with doubt, because all they hear is 2 contrary perspectives, but they don't have a way to distill which is the correct perspective. And it sounds complicated. And so it's like, well, I'll handle that later. Later never comes. And as a result, a lot of people miss the opportunity to invest in what frankly has been the best performing asset of the last 10 years and shows every sign of being the best performing asset of the next 10 years as well, which is a shame. So again, it's a lot of my work is talking to people who work in the ESG field, family offices, people in sovereign funds, pension funds, people looking to form corporate treasuries, even retail investors who are asking themselves the question, is this something which is consistent with my values and which meets the criteria of my fund?
Yes, I see. Yeah, very interesting. Well, I mean, maybe to really kick it off, I have this hunch, and I think you have it too, because I heard you say it in one of your presentations, that we seem to be, when it comes to Bitcoin, but even though there's still a lot of FUD and people are hanging on to it, we're seemingly past peak FUD already, because like a lot of good information is coming out, and you were one of the people who are contributing to this. And you've also drawn the parallel to other technologies, other disruptive technologies, that this has been the same all along if we go back in history. Can you draw some of the parallels to prior disruptive tech for us?
I think certainly we're past peak FUD when it comes to Bitcoin and energy. In terms of other categories, such as Bitcoin is too volatile, etc., and a whole lot of other messages, I think there's a lot of misinformation about those categories. So there's kind of many, many different levels of messages which are lacking nuance, let's just say, to be charitable. When it comes to Bitcoin and energy, you're right, though, we are past peak FUD. We have the data that says, yes, we've actually turned in the mainstream media from net negative reporting to largely disinterest, to be honest. But the amount of reporting overall on Bitcoin energy is probably only about 20% of what it used to be. And of that remaining 20%, most of it's actually positive now, which may surprise a lot of people. To your question around what happens with disruptive technologies generally, this is really important to understand. What we're seeing with Bitcoin, this pattern, is not new. If you look through history, I went right back to the telegraph in the 1800s, and then I looked at the bicycle in the 1890s, then the radio in the 1920s, at the time when they were first coming into mass acceptance. And then you pan forward to other technologies, including the internet. Every single technology in an unbroken chain. And look, even things like the camera or television, computers, exactly the same pattern, which is for the first 15 to 20 years, you get universally negative coverage in the media. It generally peaks, and you can track this. It peaks around about the 10-year mark, and then it starts to decline quite a lot. And then you get a second wave, which picks up, and then that'll decline. And then you get a third wave, and that'll decline. It's incredible. It actually looks very similar to how a pandemic affects an islanded nation. And I know this because I was in New Zealand, which is an islanded nation at the time of the pandemic. And I looked at the chart for COVID infections, and it was almost identical as the pattern for the spread of misinformation around novel technologies, because it does have certain viral-like properties where, to start with, what will happen, there's a couple of different factors. One is, psychologically as humans, we have this thing called negativity bias, which is really important for our evolution. And what negativity bias does is it says, given the presence of uncertain information, assume in the negative. That's the algorithm that all humans operate by. And thank goodness we do, because that's the reason that we've survived through evolution. So to give a context for this, imagine back in the day, you're out in the savannah and you see some large animal on the horizon. You can see it's an animal, but you can't see, indeed, it's too far away. So you don't know whether it's your food or you're its food. Now, if you were going to write the algorithm for how a human should behave, what would you say? What should you do? What should you assume?
Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know I published a new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment, co-written with my buddy Daniel and none other than Mexican billionaire Ricardo Salinas. It's a deep dive into the monetary system and its future. In it, we make the type of connections that go beyond what you'll hear from your average Bitcoiner, MMT advocate, or macro pundit. So grab your copy on Amazon today. You'll find the link in the show notes. And now on to today's show. Yeah, it's like you try to assume that it's probably an animal that is going to eat you, and that's why you flee.
Correct. And the reason for that is what? Because the positive payoff of assuming in the positive and being right is you get a meal. Okay? The positive payoff of assuming in the negative and you're right is you get to stay alive. Or to
Yeah,
look at the other
exactly.
way, the negative payoff of being incorrect and running away is you don't get fed. You're hungry for that day. The negative impact of assuming the positive and you're incorrect is you get eaten. So there's a very good reason that humans, given the presence of uncertainty, will assume in the negative. Thank goodness we do that. And so that's why we've treated the telegraph and the bicycle and the automobile and the internet and computers and telegraph and radios and Bitcoin in the negative before we properly understand it. So what's important is to realize is that this is not objectivity. This is a human cognitive evolutionary response in the presence of uncertain data. So that's one factor. The second factor that we have to bear in mind is disruptive technologies by definition disrupt someone. So, for example, the bicycle disrupted not one, but several industries. It disrupted the horse and buggy, public transit, the railway, and riding apparel. Pan forward in history, the radio disrupted not one, but several industries, live entertainment, print media, the telegraph, record industry. So again, 4 major industries. And then you pan forward in time, look at how many industries the internet disintermediated. Then Bitcoin disintermediates people who are mediating remittance payments, central banks, large aspects of the banking system. And so again, and also disintermediates IMF, World Bank loans. If you have countries who are using Bitcoin, who are developing a Bitcoin strategic reserve, such as Bhutan, suddenly they don't need an IMF loan anymore to be able to meet their currency reserve requirements. So it disintermediates these very large, powerful institutions. And to go back to my history, so when we were creating our technology company, we had the technology is irrelevant, but I'll share what it was. It was just after the time that Craig Venter had sequenced the human genome. And we recognized that we had all this data, but we didn't have good ways to visualize it. So my co-founder and I got together, and he had the great idea and said, well, let's design the tools so that people can use good tools to visualize all this genomic data so they can use it for studying things such as virus evolution. And we did that, and the company went pretty well, and we created a disruptive product. And then we started talking to people, molecular biologists, about our product, and they already knew about our product, but they didn't find out about it from us. They found out about it from the company that had a product that was 10 times slower, 10 times more expensive, who was threatened by us, who basically could actually end up disintermediating them eventually. But they didn't just, roll out the red carpet for us and say, look, our time's done, there's a better technology. No, they didn't. They spread a lot of misinformation about us. So we would be talking to these people and they'd say, oh, you can't use Genius because it's a small New Zealand startup and they might not be around in a year's time, so there's high risk using it for your academic publications. Okay. So there was a seed of truth in that. We were a small New Zealand startup, but they took that truth and they distorted it heavily without context. They said, well, you can't use Genius because you can't transfer your files from one format to another, so it's stuck, which was nonsense. And we found there was just more and more FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So this is a tactic that gets used throughout history. When you are the disrupted, you will do whatever you need to do in order to continue to enjoy your position of incumbency. And one of the things you can do is you may not have the best technology, but you do have the best channels to be able to spread information. False, true, or mixed. And so this happens throughout history. It happened with the 4 industries who were disintermediated with the radio, the bicycle, and it happens with Bitcoin as well. And so one thing I did is I traced the origins of a lot of these media articles. And lo and behold, where do they come from? The IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, the European Central Bank, and the Central Bank of the Netherlands, and particularly one employee of that bank. And the energy fund in particular came from an employee of a central bank. Now, that doesn't mean that what that person has to say is false. I mean, you should still treat everything on its merits, but it does mean we should think, hello, let's be a little bit cautious because there could be some vested interest at stake here in presenting this information. So I just went through and I started to look at the information that was put out about Bitcoin. And very quickly I thought, hang on, very little of this is actually based on full peer-reviewed studies. It's mostly based on 5-page commentaries, which is the academic equivalent of an opinion piece. It doesn't have to present any empirical data. When I started to talk to people from the mining industries, they said, look, a lot of this data is incorrect. It's selective. For example, I'll give you one one example, which was debunked very recently, the e-waste myth. There was some information that Bitcoin had a massive e-waste problem. Now this was a commentary, 5-page, no empirical data. One of the pieces of data said that Bitcoin mining rigs last for between 1.7 and 2.5 years, which is not true. They last for, if you talk to anyone in the Bitcoin mining industry, they'll tell you we use them for a minimum of 5 years. And then once they have gone through that first 5 years, we'll typically put them out to what we call a retirement village, which is when they're mining on an intermittent power source such as wind or solar, because they've already fully amortized. And then at the end of that, we'll send them to an equipment recycler because we can get roughly $7 per rig. We get paid to recycle them. So there's no economic advantage to us wasting them. Cambridge recently came out and challenged that original study. Cambridge is widely regarded as the gold standard when it comes to policymakers and regulators on Bitcoin mining information. And they said that original paper failed to take into account the recycling and the reuse and the resale of Bitcoin mining rigs. And based on that factor alone, we estimate that the e-waste is only 7% of what was estimated. Okay, so it's only 7%. Then you factor in that the age of the Bitcoin mining units was underestimated by a factor of at least half. You put those two things together, now suddenly you say, well, the e-waste so-called problem is actually only 3.5% of what was reported, possibly less. And for every time I did some digging, I found a similar order of magnitude anomaly between what was presented and what is reliable. Now, the interesting thing is now you actually have some really good quality, like not just commentaries, but full-length academic data on Bitcoin mining. But that's only been the case since 2022. We now have, out of the last 25 papers, in fact, 26 now, as of last week, 21 of them have concluded that there are positive environmental benefits to Bitcoin mining. Only 5 of them found negative externalities, 3 of which have now been debunked by the Digital Assets Research Institute. So the scientific consensus is on the side of saying Bitcoin is net positive for the environment. The first generation of research was based largely on commentaries, most of which have now been debunked, but were very widely reported in the media. And so that's why you have this anomaly where people like me who read the latest data and studies will say, no, Bitcoin is actually net positive for the environment. But that's not what most people believe. Just in the same way that in institutional investment, generally, you get information asymmetry. So this is just another form of information asymmetry.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, to these points, I have 2 comments by people that I usually hear, and I think you sort of addressed them already, but maybe you can flesh it out again. I mean, one thing is really like people with an academic background who might not be as informed about Bitcoin, but they just have the academic background. They would say or assume that or argue that there seem to be a lot of critical papers, peer-reviewed papers that have figured out Bitcoin's detrimental impact. And I think you're telling me now, well, this is actually not the case. And maybe the other point is then also that more positive studies now that have found that Bitcoin is maybe not as bad. These people say, well, they have all been sponsored and funded by miners and Bitcoin adjacent groups. What is your counter argument there?
Yeah, well, the counter argument is very simple, and that's not factually correct. Of those 21 papers, only 2 of them had any affiliation with Bitcoin mining industry. So the other 19 had 0 affiliation. So, okay, let's put those 2 papers to one side. Now, by the way, if you're going to be using that logic, you should also put aside any paper that had an affiliation with a central bank. So there goes probably about 90% of the negative articles as well. So if you're going to apply that rubric, you have to apply it uniformly. My preference is to go, okay, just because they're affiliated either with a central bank or with the mining industry doesn't mean the paper is null and void. You can only null and void a paper based on its merits. Otherwise, it's an ad hominem argument. So you should include the ones that are written by central bankers, debunk them based on merits. And you should look at the ones that have industry involvement and debunk them based on their merits. Issue is that it just so happens that the ones that are written with Bitcoin mining industry involvement, they're not less robust, they're more robust for a very simple reason, is that they're written by people, or they have the collaboration of people who understand Bitcoin mining, which I think is a good idea. If you're going to get IT advice from someone, you probably like to get IT advice from someone who has used a computer, which is it sounds obvious, but it's not the case. Most of the people who've written these negative articles on Bitcoin mining have never used Bitcoin, have never been inside a Bitcoin mining facility, have never talked to people in the Bitcoin mining industry. And that's one of the reasons that you get these, frankly, shocking levels of ignorance in these papers. I'll give you an example. One of the first ones, very widely quoted, in fact, it was in Nature magazine. They projected that Bitcoin mining was going to contribute to climate change. However, what they did was they assumed that at the time, parabolic rise in Bitcoin price was going to continue. Of course, it did not. And they didn't understand what was called the difficulty adjustment, right? Which means that as it's mining more Bitcoin, it becomes progressively more difficult to mine. This is a fundamental, absolutely fundamental. It's like doing physics and not understanding that you have things called
gravity,
or gravity. Yeah, it's like writing a paper about gravity and concluding humans are going to float off into the air because you don't understand the impact. So absolutely fundamental to the science of Bitcoin. Did not understand that. There was also a unit transposition error of a factor of 1,000. So again, we're not looking at, I often say Bitcoin deserves better critics. I want there to be critics of Bitcoin. It's important. As a climate tech investor, you want every industry to be held to account to a high standard, but those criticisms should be based on an understanding of what it is you're criticizing. And for the most part, we just have not had that. And to the point about the peer-reviewed research, again, a lot of these academic papers were not full-length papers. They were commentaries, which is a 5-page op-ed, which does not need to present novel empirical data, most of which have now been debunked they've been debunked in 2 peer-reviewed studies for gross inaccuracies. I'll give you one more example. So one very widely quoted statistic, which has even made it through into EU regulations, this is how pervasive the virus has been the notion that Bitcoin uses energy per transaction. Now, again, anyone who knows even the fundamental basics of Bitcoin mining, or not even Bitcoin mining, just Bitcoin, will tell you that Bitcoin energy consumption does not come from its transactions. It comes from the process of minting new Bitcoins through validating blocks, which is completely different to the use of Bitcoin. The other thing that's important to understand is that there's 2 layers to Bitcoin. So I've got a cell phone here, and on it, I've done roughly 600 transactions over the last 2 years using the layer 2 network or the Lightning network. That's had not only zero energy, but you can do billions of transactions on that for no energy cost whatsoever. It's incredibly scalable. It's much faster. There's no fees attached. So again, some of this goes into other misinformation of Bitcoin, which is like it can't scale, or the fees are too expensive, which again, it's like conflating. It's like saying, yes, well, of course, if you go to a cafe and you try a wire transaction and pay $30 and wait 5 days, then yeah, that'll be clunky. Similarly, if you try to use the Bitcoin layer 1, the blockchain itself, for making small retail transactions, yeah, that's going to be clunky, but that's not an indictment of the technology. That's an indictment of the chosen method of the user for that transaction. So you generally, whether it's fiat or whether it's a blockchain technology, when it comes to a large transaction, you will use the one which is more secure, even though it has higher fees. And when it's a smaller transaction, you use the one which is slightly less secure, which will be Visa if it's fiat, or which will be Lightning if it's Bitcoin, because it has less fees, it's faster, and you trade a little bit of security. So coming back to energy use per transaction, this has been used to say Bitcoin uses a lot of energy per transaction. But then there were like 3 spin-off papers. It has a lot of carbon footprint per transaction. Okay, it uses a lot of it has a lot of e-waste per transaction. We've already talked about e-waste. And it uses a lot of water per transaction. But they're all based on the same fundamental flaw, which is that Bitcoin energy use does not come from its transactions. So it's a little bit like, imagine you drive in your car and you're driving, it's not an electric car, it's a fossil fuel driven car. So it has an environmental footprint. EVs have an environmental footprint too, but let's leave that to one side. So it has direct emissions. Now, as you're driving your car, you play the radio and you play some songs on the radio. Now, technically, we can calculate how many miles you've traveled in a year, how many emissions that car's created, and then we can measure the number of songs you've listened to. And we can say, well, now we can create this metric, which is how many emissions were released per song that you listen to. Oh, technically that's true, you can do that, but it's a nonsense metric because the emissions do not come from the songs. But once you've created that spurious metric, now you can do all sorts of crazy things. You can infer, oh, well, you should really listen to fewer songs because that'll decrease your emissions. Well, no, it won't, because the two things they're independent variables. Please don't listen to more songs because that's going to be bad for the environment. Similarly, people have then, once this emission per transaction statistic was come, you can see where you can go with it. Well, now when Bitcoin scales, when it has more transactions, it's going to create more emissions. Well, no, it won't, for the same reason that playing more songs on the radio isn't going to create more emissions from your car. The process of mining is what uses energy. And the other thing we've got to consider is that, coming back to the point of energy literacy, and this is something I had to wrestle with as well. Ever since we were children, we were told, with good reason by our parents, turn off the light, don't waste electricity, right? Conserve power. Good messages, good messages. The problem is that we've kind of assumed, we've got it hardwired into us that less consumption is good, more consumption is bad. And when we go to the grid scale, that actually it's not as straightforward as that. It's like saying consuming more food is bad, but consuming less food is good. It's more healthy. Well, no, it's not. It depends on the nature of food you're consuming. If you're consuming more chocolate cake, yeah, it's probably bad. If consuming more fresh, healthy, organic fruit and vegetable, it probably doesn't matter. In fact, you probably want more of that. And so it's the same with consuming energy. Not all energy types are equal. When you have large inflexible loads, such as AI inference data centers, then yes, having more of that type of consumption, that's problematic for the grid because they have to be able to supply that energy consumer with 24/7 electricity with what's called 5 nines availability, which is 99.999% of the time that data center has to be up. That's not the case with Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining, even though they're both data centers, they could not be more different in that Bitcoin mining data centers are the single most flexible user of electricity we have ever had. And that has tremendous advantages to the grid operator. It's the grid equivalent to your fresh, healthy, organic fruit and veg. It's the thing you actually want more of, not less of. So I'll give you an example. And again, this is not my opinion. This is not only what the peer-reviewed research says, but this is what the people who have used Bitcoin mining on their grid have said. People such as Brad Jones, the late Brad Jones, when he was the CEO of ERCOT, when he presided over the period of time where, after the 2021 Storm Uri, where there were blackouts, he did two things. The first thing is he weatherized all the equipment so that it would be more resilient. Because what had happened is, during the ice storm, a lot of the gas plants had frozen key parts and they couldn't deliver gas, but also the wind turbines, the blades had frozen, they couldn't deliver wind. So you had less generation. At the same time, everyone went home and they turned on their heating, so you had more demand. So you have this terrible situation where you have less generation at exactly the time you have more demand.
You needed
That's what flipped the grid. The grid blacked out. It couldn't respond. Businesses lost billions. People lost lives who are on life support. And the grid operator, the former one, lost their job. So the mandate of the grid operator is keep the grid running. It's life or death. And as you start to put more variable renewable energy onto the grid, it becomes progressively harder to do that. So this is getting into the piece that I had no understanding of whatsoever. So I was a big renewable energy fan. I'm still a big renewable energy fan because we have to decarbonize our grid. It's non-negotiable. How we do that is really important. And this is what a lot of people don't realize. One of the things that happens, and what grid operators do, is they say, well, solar and wind, we've been told we have to put more of this on the grid, and okay, we'll do that. But they're unreliable power sources. If the sun goes behind a cloud or the wind stops blowing, then we've only got a couple of options. Either we have huge supply of battery power. Now, batteries are very expensive and they only deliver roughly 4 hours of discharge. So there's a limit to how effective they can be. They're part of the solution, but they're not the full solution. So what do? They say, well, we have to have a backup source of power for when we don't have that intermittent renewable energy available. So what's that backup power? What's the best? It has to be really fast to deploy, and it has to be able to deploy at scale. And what's that typically going to be? It's going to be what's called a gas peaker plant. So a gas peaker plant is what? This is what the grid operator has in backup for when that variable renewable energy isn't available, and they have to immediately supplement it. Now, in order to supplement it fast so you don't get blackouts, that gas peaker plant has to be running 24/7. It has to be idling. So it's
Wow.
releasing CO2 emissions all through the entire year, even though it may only be used for 6% of the year. Now, here's one area where Bitcoin mining can really help. So one solution is you have to increase your generation for when the sun goes behind a cloud, the wind stops blowing. The other solution is you can immediately ramp down energy usage. And so that's what Brad Jones realized he could do. And at the same time as Hathaway Energy, so Berkshire Hathaway's company, was lobbying for the purchase of $10 billion on gas peaker plants. What was happening at the same time, completely coincidentally, was that miners were coming out of China because they'd just been booted out, a lot of them. And they came onto the Texas grid for the most part. Some of them went to Kazakhstan, then to Texas. Some of them came straight to Texas. Some of them went to Paraguay or other parts of the world, but a lot of them came to Texas. So suddenly you had this new type of consumer. And Brad Jones was saying, well, what are these? He had no knowledge of Bitcoin, no knowledge of Bitcoin mining. And he said, well, who are these people? What are they doing? Are they good for the grid? Are they bad for the grid? And the people would explain to him, well, basically, they're just these big data centers, but they can shut off and shut on their electricity really fast because they don't lose anything. They're running a discrete process trillions of times per second. So and he's like, they can shut off and shut on really fast. Okay. How much load is there? They got up to 3 gigawatts of load. He was like, okay, you're telling me we've got this energy consumer, which is 3 gigawatts of energy. That's enough to supply, of power rather. That's enough to supply 3 million people. That's a huge amount of energy. And they can shut off within 500 milliseconds. Well, put them on our demand response program right now. In other words, put them on the program such that when we need energy delivered back to the grid, they can shut off. And that's exactly what happened. And they were so effective at balancing load at the time when the renewable energy wasn't available from solar and wind that he didn't need to spend $10 billion on fossil fuel dependent gas peaker plants. Bitcoin obviated them. So there's another industry sector who's now unhappy with Bitcoin because it's disruptive to gas peaker plants as well. Now, some people sometimes, and this was one of my thoughts, I was like saying, well, is that really a benefit? Because surely they were using all that electricity in the first place, and wasn't that creating a strain on the grid? And the answer is no, because that's only half the equation. The other half of the equation, which is really important to understand, and it's a story that doesn't get told, is that the reason that Texas had gone from 80 gigawatts to 140 gigawatts of renewable generation over a 3-year period would never have been possible were it not for Bitcoin mining. So I want to unpack that because that's counterintuitive. The other huge advantage of Bitcoin mining being a flexible energy consumer is it means two things. Number one, it's flexible with where it can locate. So where are most solar farms and wind farms built? They're built where there are no people, where land is cheap. Often they've been given subsidies, right? They go where the land is the cheapest and they can get the best return on their subsidized investment. Okay. And then they strike a problem because the subsidy was never given for generating power that was used. The subsidy was given by building renewable capacity, which is a bit of a problem because you're not incentivizing the use of that energy. You're only incentivizing the building of it. So all around the world, in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, in North Germany, in Scotland, in Darwin, in Australia, you've got all this solar and wind energy that's been built, normally under government subsidies. Same happened in Texas. Most of the wind and solar power was built in West Texas. All the consumers of that energy are in West Texas. And again, this comes to my point about we live in a wired world. So you can't deliver that wirelessly. It's got to be delivered through wires. But a wire is like a highway. And if you're trying to drive a whole lot of traffic down a one-lane bridge, it's not going to work. You're going to get congestion. And that was what was happening on grids. So most of that power had been built, couldn't be used. And so that created these white elephants. And whilst it is absolutely true that renewable energy is more cost effective than fossil fuel, that's only true when it's been used. If it's been built somewhere and it's not able to be used, that's no longer true. And that's why that renewable energy has come under attack. It's not that renewable energy is the problem, it's a solution. But it becomes a problem when it's built in areas which don't make sense, where it's been incentivized by getting a distorted signal. And that's happened a lot. So what Bitcoin mining companies will do is they'll come up to these wind generation facilities or solar facilities that people are starting to complain about because they're essentially white elephants that aren't delivering electricity to very many people, and you still need the gas peaker plants when they can't. And they'll say, look, we'll take that load. We'll take the load where otherwise you'd have to curtail it. The other thing that happens is that the grid operator has to pay, in many cases, the solar operator or the wind operator a fee to not take their energy. And that often gets passed on to the end consumer. So that's another reason that it can be the case. This isn't the case in all jurisdictions, but this can make renewable energy more expensive. When you have a custom for that energy, though, then suddenly you don't have curtailment. Because you don't have curtailment, you don't have a curtailment fee. Because you don't have a curtailment fee, that cost doesn't get passed on to taxpayers or consumers of energy.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that happens is it makes the solar operation or the wind operator more profitable because now they've got a customer. Now, they're not paying very much relative to what they could get selling it to the grid, but they're paying something, which is better than nothing. And that often is the difference between, in fact, the peer review literature suggests this. This is the difference in many cases for a 50 gigawatts. That's quite a big solar plant that can supply energy for 50,000 people. If you build that facility and you try and get a return on investment without Bitcoin mining, just over 8 years. If you do it with Bitcoin mining as a customer, 3.7 years.
Yeah. You
It's a huge
amortize
difference.
a lot
And what do
quickly.
they do with that profit? They do what any sensible business owner will do. They pour it back into expanding their business, which means more solar, more wind, and that accelerates the renewable energy transition. So two things happening in parallel. Number one, you're getting more renewable energy built because it's more profitable, because you have that customer often on site in the form of Bitcoin mining companies. And then secondly, when you need that load to come off the grid, Bitcoin mining companies can do it in 500 milliseconds, half a second, which means you keep the grid stable and you don't need gas peaker plants.
That's a lot of amazing points, and I feel like people will enjoy and have to digest this. I certainly have to re-listen to some of this as well. But I mean, from what I'm getting, all the points that you're now explaining, sort of, this is really Bitcoin. It's not bad for the environment, But some people might then argue, okay, I get it, points taken. It doesn't seem to be bad as we thought it is. But we do have more pressing climate issues to solve first. But what you're getting at, I feel like, is even like, well, Bitcoin is not only not bad for the environment, but it's actually indispensable climate action. And we have to take a look at this, right?
Yeah, and again, this is not my opinion. This is what the peer-reviewed data is telling us. This is what the experts at the intersection of energy and grids and Bitcoin mining are telling us. This is what the utility companies are telling us. This is what the grid operators are telling us. Everyone who has an informed opinion about Bitcoin mining is telling us exactly the same thing, which is that it is critical, and this will be brain scrambling to a lot of people, but it is absolutely critical to the green energy transition. Now, to give you an idea just how critical, so I was speaking to a guy called Kenji, who is a nuclear safety engineer. And you might think, well, how is that relevant to Bitcoin mining or renewable energy? Incredibly relevant, because he was the engineer who was responsible for coordinating the Japanese and the American nuclear scientist response effort after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And after that occurred, Japan went from having 56 nuclear power plants to having 14 that were operational. Can you imagine what that did to the energy of that country? And suddenly they had to find another way to supply energy. So how did they do that? Well, firstly, they had to import a lot of fossil fuel energy. But the second thing they did was they immediately started creating new intermittent variable renewable energy. So solar and wind. And very quickly, they realized exactly these challenges, that you still needed gas peaker plants, that you had highly intermittent power sources, that you had to overbuild capacity, that a lot of it got wasted, that a lot of that cost was passed on. And then Ken started to research. He was given a directive by the largest utility in Japan, TEPCO, to start looking at different ways to load balance this renewable energy. And he looked at a number of different sources, including Bitcoin mining, concluded Bitcoin mining was by far the best because it had three features that others didn't, which could quickly curtail load. Number one, it could do it faster than any other form except batteries. Batteries can go even faster still. Second was that it didn't incur a cost. So it was like a private enterprise coming in. So rather than grid operator having to buy batteries, they could just engage with private enterprise. It was location agnostic. It could shut off for days at a time. Whereas the traditional sources such as a steel factory or an aluminium smelter, which they might say, can you curtail your load? They'd only get about 4 hours before suddenly you have irreversible industrial processes, steel hardening, for example, and that couldn't be reversed. So they weren't good ways to curtail load. But Bitcoin mining was an extremely good one because all they lost was that little bit of Bitcoin they couldn't mine. And I was talking to him recently. I said, look, you've seen this firsthand. What's your impression of how much variable renewable energy you can put on a grid before you start to get fundamental grid balancing issues? He said around about 50%. After that, it becomes extremely difficult. And that's exactly what Denmark have found. They very quickly went up to 50% solar and wind, and then it's kind of 50, 51, 48, 49, 52. It's started to taper off for this exact reason. I said, what about if you put Bitcoin mining there to load balance it? He said 70%. That's 20% more variable renewable energy you can put on a grid if you have the most flexible load balancer in the world to counterbalance the intermittency of that variable renewable resource, plus incentivize the building of more because it becomes more profitable because you always have a customer and you never have curtailment.
Yeah, and I would assume like people are actually figuring this out as we speak, maybe also throughout Europe. And because now you've pointed to Texas as well, but I
You're going
feel
to
like
see a lot. I mean, at the moment, it's fairly nascent in Europe, but you're going to see, again, very quickly, more utilities starting to embrace it. Already you've had Deutsche Telekom, the largest telecom in Germany, who has embraced Bitcoin mining because they've gone into renewable energy. And this is what happens. As soon as a company diversifies into renewable energy, the first thing they notice is we've got a lot of wasted energy. If they follow that line of thought and they ask the second question, which is, well, can we monetize this? Then it's just from first principles, you will arrive at Bitcoin. You will become a Bitcoin mining advocate. Even if you know nothing about Bitcoin, you don't care about sound money, you don't have to. You approach it simply from the point of view of you don't want to waste renewable energy. And that'll lead you immediately, if you continue that line of thought, into Bitcoin mining. Because right now, maybe in the future we'll have others, but right now, Bitcoin mining's it. There is no more flexible way to monetize that renewable energy.
yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes total sense. Do you have also any thoughts on like the how sort of emergent green technologies, maybe also like nuclear, which there seems to be a renaissance going on there as well. And then some people have spoken of nuclear microreactions, how they might integrate with Bitcoin mining in the future. Any thoughts on such futuristic stuff?
Where I think nuclear becomes very interesting is in terms of what's happening in France at the moment, which is you have a nation which has a lot of nuclear energy. Now, whether that's last generation, whether that's next generation modular thorium reactors, they are more flexible in that they can shut off and shut on off faster, but they're still not ideally suited to being shut off and shut on. Nuclear power just likes to, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert on the latest generation, but certainly the last generation likes to just run and run and run and run. And whenever you try and shut it off, you have to go through a lot of safety procedures. So there's some safety considerations there. There's a process involved. It's expensive. But more importantly, it creates a lot of wear and tear on that nuclear reactor. Now, what's happened in France recently is France has built a lot of extra solar and wind, and as they should have, so that's positive. What's not so positive is that when they have been facing that intermittency issue, they have been using their nuclear facilities to load balance. So in other words, you suddenly get some more solar and wind. They're curtailing the nuclear power production, so actually shutting off nuclear facilities. and then that sun goes behind a cloud, they're firing them up again. Nuclear power was never designed to be quickly ramped up and ramped down. If you you can see where I'm going with that. You need a shock absorber in the middle, and that shock absorber, we already have it. It's called Bitcoin mining. It's the most flexible shock absorber for surplus renewable energy you've ever had. And that means you can keep those nuclear facilities running. It means they're more safe, less expensive to shut them on and off, but most importantly, you're not going to create wear and tear, which would otherwise mean that those assets will reach end of life years earlier than they would have because you've used them in the wrong way. Just like a car. If you're driving that in a certain way, you're revving it hard, you're braking lots, you're going to wear that car out much faster. And it's exactly the same with those nuclear reactors. So I see tremendous potential for Bitcoin, particularly in countries which have a lot of nuclear energy and a lot of variable renewable energy, to be that shock absorber in the middle so you don't have to use your nuclear facilities to do that load balancing. That's the area that I get the most excited.
Yeah. Okay, I see. Yeah, it's so fascinating how all of this really adds up. I mean, a somewhat different question, but still maybe related or adjacent is in terms of mining. It's also within the Bitcoin sector. Some people have been complaining that this has been centralizing over the years. But from what I'm hearing and just extrapolating, I feel like these developments would help also with the centralization fear and aspect of mining, right? Would you agree?
Yes, because what we're talking about here is using stranded and wasted energy. And stranded and wasted energy exists in pockets. You don't typically have huge amounts of stranded and wasted energy in one place. Sometimes you will. You might have, for example, Mara has recently purchased a 114 megawatt wind farm in Texas. And that wind farm was exactly an example of what I was describing, where it was built without thought of how it could supply power to the grid. So most of the time it wasn't. And when it tried to supply power to the grid, it was actually oversupplying power and creating headaches for the grid operator. So what they did is they took it offline, they're using it for Bitcoin mining. But when the power is needed, that power is still sold back to the grid. So it's done three things. Number one, you're monetizing that asset. Secondly, you're removing the instability that it was causing and also the backlash it was causing against renewable energy. But the third thing is you're monetizing an asset, right? That you wouldn't otherwise. You are supplying grid stabilization services and you're removing the stigma which is attached to a lot of these white elephant renewable assets. So three things in one. So that's 114 megs, but typically they're not that big. It might be, so for example, what we've started doing is we're looking at landfills, which is another source of stranded wasted energy. And in the case of landfills, why that's stranded and wasted is you have all this methane. So whenever you have waste which decays without the presence of air, which is every single landfill, because it gets compacted so it doesn't get air. So unlike your compost heap, which you turn, it gets aerated, it creates carbon dioxide, which is part of the biogenic cycle. In landfills, it creates methane. You have these things called methanotropes, and it creates a lot of methane.
Which is a lot worse than CO2, right?
Which is a lot worse. In fact, it's 84 times more warming to the planet over a 20-year period. It's in fact, the United Nations has called it our single biggest lever to slow climate change in the next 25 years, which complements our CO2 reduction strategies. And yet, in the climate tech field, this is what I was amazed by. Only 2% of our financing goes towards methane reduction. So one of the reasons I chose to focus on methane was that, well, not many people are, but it's a critically important issue. And one of the top three causes of anthropogenic methane is landfills. They produce huge amounts of methane. And in fact, our satellite measurements show that it's producing roughly twice as much as what we thought, because we used to just infer how much methane was created by doing some chemical equations based on the amount of organic waste. But now we can actually measure what comes out of them. We know that we've underestimated, and it's twice what we thought it was. And what do you do with that methane then? A lot of people say, well, we should stop waste. We should do organic diversion. There's no question that's part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
Putting organic stuff into landfills is a really bad idea. It should go back to the soil.
Easier said than done, I guess. Yeah.
I agree. And what can be done? In Auckland, where I used to live, that has been done. The problem is that doesn't solve the legacy issue, right? You've still got 50 years of organic waste, which is in those landfills, and that breaks down very slowly. And even if you stop all organic waste tomorrow around the world in a coordinated effort, which has never happened ever, then you would still have another 50 years of methane release. So what do you do with that legacy? It's not like farms, for example. If you stop producing methane from farms, it solves the problem straight away. If you stop producing it from oil fields, it solves it straight away. You stop sending waste to landfills, it solves it in 50 years, right? So what do you do? Well, the solutions are you can use a gas, you can turn into what's called RNG, renewable natural gas in the States, biomethane in Europe. Okay, that's one use. It's extremely expensive, very high environmental permitting. You've got to distribute that gas, which means you get fugitive gas emissions all through the line, right to the point where it gets used by residents. The infrastructure cost is about 10 times more than if you do what's the more common technique, which is you turn it into power. So in other words, you purify that methane, you send it to a generator on site. That generator, because methane is basically just natural gas, you get rid of the things you don't want going into a generator. You put it under some compression, you remove the condensation, you send it to a generator on site, big Caterpillar engines, huge things, or Jenbach is another one, and that generates electricity, and then you sell that electricity to the grid. Well, that's all very well if you are near the grid, or if the grid can take that power without a major substation upgrade, or if you're living in a country where you're allowed to sell it to the grid. I live in Costa Rica, you're not allowed to sell power to the grid. So for a lot of countries in the world, that's just not possible. It's totally wasted, stranded energy. But as you say, it's not just wasted and stranded, it's pollution. It's causing climate change at an unprecedented rate. So this is an urgent problem. What do you do with it? Well, you can't sell it to the grid. Power generation is the most economical source. That means you have no choice, but you have to have an on-site customer. Well, who in their right mind is going to want to set up their business on a landfill? You're not going to get a retail store. You're not going to get Louis Vuitton setting up their business there. You're not going to get a hospital setting up their hospital on a landfill so they get cheap power. Methane's a pollutant. The only ones who are going to do it is data center operators. And of those data centers, there's only one type of data center who's going to pay all the extra money for the capital expense of laying those pipes to collect the methane and the extra generators you've got to pay for, which cost about $1 million per megawatt. And that's Bitcoin mining companies. Not because they're more environmentally minded. They're not. They're engineers like the next person at the next industry. They'll just do what makes more economic sense. But fortunately, it makes economic sense to do the thing that just happens to be right for the environment, because 80% of their operational costs is power. And that means it does make economic sense to them to invest that gas capture and collection. It does make economic sense for them to buy those generators because they'll get a return on investment in 3.5 years rather than 8.5 years. And that makes all the difference. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, we're going to provide the capital to these Bitcoin mining companies to go in, because that was the other gap. It fell in the gap between no venture capitalists wanted to invest because there's no intellectual property, which is novel. No private equity wanted to invest because it was too small a scale. So we set up a firm. We said, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to help solve this problem by being the financer in the middle who will finance these operations so we can get more Bitcoin mining happening on landfills. So there's 4 companies in the world who are doing it right now, stranded wasted energy. So it's a few megawatts here, a few megawatts there. But you're right, to your point of decentralization, I'll come right back to that. The more that these Bitcoin mining companies are sniffing out, they will naturally gravitate to where is the cheapest source of electricity. And that will always be stranded and wasted electricity. And that will naturally, through its inbuilt economic incentive, decentralize the Bitcoin mining network more and more.
Yeah, exactly. And the more of this stranded energy we use, the more is also this other argument debunked that I'm sometimes hearing, well, Bitcoin is stealing energy from somewhere else. I mean, if it's stranded energy and we're using it, then you're not stealing anything, sort of.
I read an article once that was talking about the amount of food that ants eat in a year, that it was equivalent to the population of Manhattan. But you can't infer from that, well, those ants are bad. You know, they're stealing that food from people. That's crumbs that no one would have eaten. And Bitcoin's the same. Troy Cross, a good friend of mine, calls Bitcoin mining the dung beetle. It's using that energy that no one else wants, no one else can access. It's too small, too inconvenient to access, and it's finding ways to access it. But not because they're virtuous, but because it makes economic sense, because the economic impulse is so large. It's mind-boggling. There has never been a business ever where 80% of your entire operational costs have been power. And that means there's never been a business who is so incentivized to use the stranded and wasted energy that it just does not make economic sense for someone who only has it as 10 or 30% of their Powerball to go chase.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I see. Yeah. Just fascinating. That's amazing. Well, I think we've gone over an hour and really got this masterclass now on the E out of ESG. Thanks a lot for that. But maybe we can quickly turn to the S and G for a couple of minutes if you're still down for it, and just really also see where this comes in, because I feel like if you want to make the entire ESG case for Bitcoin, obviously the S and the G are relevant as well. So what are
Yeah.
your thoughts there?
I think the G we can cover very quickly. The G really Bitcoin hits out of the park because a lot of the issue with governance is you have centralized government, which is subject to capture, subject to not doing what's in the interests of people. So Bitcoin by design has the best governance structure imaginable, which is peer-to-peer participatory democracy. There is no centralized institute. There was no founders who got allocated shares or Bitcoin. The only way to get Bitcoin was you had to mine it or you had to buy it, right? In terms of the voting rights, there's no, okay, you earn more Bitcoin, so you get more voting rights. It's completely distributed. So it's literally the only example I can think of where participatory democracy has scaled effectively. So it's got an incredible governance structure, which naturally orients it towards conservatism, so because it requires consensus. And in the times where that's been threatened, and when large institutions have tried to do things which were in their interests, but not in the interests of the users of Bitcoin, we had that test, and that happened in 2017 with the block size wars, where a certain community wanted to make the block size bigger, which really would have meant that you could only be a node owner of Bitcoin if you had these big supercomputers, which only large institutions could afford. And the community booted them out. They didn't have the most money, but again, it was participatory democracy working and keeping that network safe so it remained decentralized and remained something that anyone could contribute to. So it's got an incredible governance structure. I think this is something that there'll be a lot of academic work on in the future to show just how effective it's been. So you don't get that centralized group who can capture it and use it to its own end. In terms of the social side, this is something I get very excited about, and it's really an episode in its own right. But what I will say is this: Bitcoin solves a lot of problems that are not seen in the West. Very often I hear people say, well, Bitcoin doesn't have a use case. Now, unfortunately, that's more a statement about the person saying it than it is about Bitcoin. What they're really saying is, I haven't seen a use case for Bitcoin, or I haven't read about a Bitcoin use case, or I haven't imagined what life might be like in a country which does not have strong banking rails, which does not have a stable currency, which is not a liberal democracy, where you can have your assets frozen for saying the wrong thing, for doing the wrong thing, for participating in the wrong protest. Most of Bitcoin's utility, now it's not to say it doesn't have utility in the West, it absolutely does, not only as a store of value, but a number of other things as well. But most of it, and this is what's very unique, I look at technology adoption. I've never seen a technology where its utility is felt in the global South first and in the West last. If you look at telecommunications, for example, it was the opposite. The mobile rollout was done, the 4G rollouts were done in the West first, and then it was, Europe and Southeast Asia, North America, and then, only then, very last was Africa. If you look at Africa and Latin America, they're the places in the world where Bitcoin adoption is happening the fastest because it solves fundamental problems. So in the same way that in Africa, you didn't have landlines in a lot of places, but then you didn't need them because you got mobile technology and it superseded. You leapfrogged straight from talking to each other face to face to being able to use a mobile network. In the same way, in Africa, you can leapfrog from using cash, which is risky. You can be robbed, you can be mugged, etc., to being able to use and be your own bank. You don't have to use a centralized banking system in the middle. And that's, again, tremendously empowering. So a lot of the uses we're seeing might be, for example, you're a woman in Afghanistan and the country has been sanctioned not because of your beliefs, but because of your government, which you may disagree with. But it's impacted your life, the sanctions. So economic times have got harder. And you also have a government which discriminates against you and says, as a woman, you're not allowed to have a bank account without your husband's permission. You're not allowed to set up a business. You're not allowed to pay invoices or receive invoices. And you think, well, I don't agree with that. I never signed up to being part of a regime which discriminated against me based on my gender. Well, now you have an out, because you can be your own bank with Bitcoin. And this is exactly what started happening, where people have set up Bitcoin payments, where now you can have female entrepreneurs paying female staff using Bitcoin, bypassing state-level gender discrimination. You've got an organization, an NGO in Afghanistan, which is set up teaching women how to code, how to do software development. All the payments, all the donations are handled in Bitcoin, because if they were handled centrally or through stablecoins, they'd be frozen. They can't use the SWIFT network because they've been cut off through sanctions. There's no Apple Pay. There's no Visa that's available. So the only way they have to do this is in Bitcoin. And then you might look at somewhere like Argentina, which is another case where Bitcoin adoption is very high. Well, why might it be high in Argentina? Well, because it's had double-digit, in some cases triple-digit inflation for many years out of the last 20 or even 30. And so the currency has lost its purchasing power. So if you saved in the bank, if you're one of the wealthy, you'd find ways around it. You'd put into assets, real estate, gold. But if you're one of the middle class or the working class, you had no way around that. So you would just have your family's wealth absolutely shattered by the loss of purchasing power of your local currency. Now you can put into Bitcoin and you can save the purchasing power of that currency, which is at an existential level of value. And then you might look at someone in Nigeria, where they've had protests for a long time against authoritarian rule. And for a long time, those protesters were targeted. Their bank accounts were frozen. People who donated to their causes, their bank accounts were frozen. Now, of course, this happens in the West too from time to time, but it happens very much regularly in these authoritarian regimes. And so now these human rights activists have been able to continue their struggle, to continue to speak up against atrocities, against authoritarian regimes, and they cannot have their bank account frozen because there is no intermediary. It goes peer-to-peer. And because it's going peer-to-peer, there's also no fees in the middle. There's no Western Union clipping the ticket. There's no one who can seize or freeze or surveil or profit in the middle. It goes peer-to-peer instantaneously. And we've never had that. So again, most of its social utility is felt as a tool of human justice. It's just phenomenal, and we're only just starting to scratch the surface. And as that starts to expand, we'll start to see more and more human rights activists use it, more and more people who are unbanked using it, and more people using it so that they can preserve their family's wealth, what little they have, in the face of a hyperinflating or even just high inflating currency.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, these are all very valid points for sure. And you also alluded to it yourself. Like, some people are pointing to stable coins being the solution, but as you said, I mean, they sort of, how would I
Stable
say,
coins have stability,
have
but
the
they're
same
not to
problems
survive.
as fiat.
Yeah, they're really not, because you can contact a centralized authority and ask them to block a payment. They rely on the existence of different banking systems or the SWIFT network. So I've actually written an article on the difference between stable coins and Bitcoin. So they absolutely have a utility, and it's thanks partly to stable coins that Bitcoin has such liquidity today. And in the same breath, we can also say that for most of the people who are in the developing world, Bitcoin is going to be the much better option, because it is the peer-to-peer centralized network that circumvents exactly the problems that in some ways other currencies, cryptocurrencies, including stablecoins, which have a centralized architecture, they replicate some
provide. Yeah.
disadvantage of the existing fiat system.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's amazing. I have one last question, because given we've spoken so highly of Bitcoin, and obviously rightly so, the question would be to finish off, where are the blind spots? Maybe
Yeah, there
also
are
within
some,
the
definitely. Like
community.
any emerging technologies, there's things, and this is why I say Bitcoin deserves better critics, because the criticism of Bitcoin today are mostly coming from people who have no understanding of Bitcoin. The legitimate criticisms we should have, or more the things we should be careful and cautious about. Number one, whilst we are heading towards more decentralization of the mining network, this is something we have to be watchful of. If mining gets too centralized, or even if the mining pools become too decentralized, then some of that governance advantage can be lost. Firstly, the second thing we need to be cautious of is, whilst at the moment it's 52% renewable, sustainable energy based, again, that, as I've been at pains to point out, that's not true because Bitcoin mining companies are more green. That's true because it happens coincidentally to align with economic incentive. Should that change, and should fossil fuel get subsidized, for example, heavily, which is possible, or should it just be in a part of the world where suddenly you have a surplus of gas energy, then you may get some anomalies where it could use more fossil fuels. So that's something that, again, we should be mindful of. And I think, like all currencies as well, any currency has the potential where people who hold a lot of it have the potential where they can manipulate price. And so this is not a criticism of Bitcoin. This is a vulnerability of any traded major asset class. So these are just things that we need to be mindful of. The other thing I would say, which is a legitimate criticism of Bitcoin, is it's not perfectly private. Okay, Bitcoin does have good privacy, but it's not perfect, as Ross Ulbricht found out from Silk Road, right? This is why the argument Bitcoin is used for criminals is actually, for every Bitcoiner who's a criminal who uses Bitcoin, there's about 200 or 500 who use fiat, for this exact reason, that it's actually not a very good tool of privacy.
Yeah.
But it does mean that if you're transacting large amounts, it is possible, whilst it's pseudonymous and you don't know whose name is on the ledger, it is a digital public ledger. So there are trade-offs. You can't have perfect transparency and perfect privacy. You've got to make choices. Bitcoin, I think, gets it about right, because whilst it's not perfectly private, there is a large overhead to try to work out and reverse engineer who is responsible for which payment. So it's just not going to happen for small micro payments. But it might happen if, say, for example, a reoccurrence of a Silk Road where you have a large website which is doing illicit transactions at scale. So these are some of the things I think that are the legitimate things that we should watch out for, as we should with any nascent technology.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely some fair points. And exactly, there's it's this knife example all the time. Technology is just neutral in that sense, and it depends on how people use it in the end. But yeah, thanks a lot for sharing all these insights with us. This was excellent. Any last thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
I think a lot of people look at Bitcoin and they see something which seems hard to understand, and that can cause them not to embrace it. Or they look at the people who are using it and say, well, this seems to be a technology that's been embraced by Donald Trump. I don't agree with Donald Trump, so I don't agree with Bitcoin. I mean, that's like in the early days saying, hey, some people are using the internet for political causes I don't agree with, therefore I'm not going to use the internet. Again, to your point, Bitcoin is not political. So don't believe anyone who tells you it is. Bitcoin is a neutral, open, peer-to-peer technology with no founders, no governance structure, no pre-mine, no policy, no board. Its monetary policy is baked in algorithmically. It is neutral. You cannot get more neutral than that. The people who use it will use it for whatever they want to use it for. If Donald Trump wants to use it, great. If Republicans want to use it, great. If criminals want to use it, great, right? Everyone will use it, like every other technology. And what we need to be in the pattern of doing is being less tribal in our appreciation of a technology and say, that's actually irrelevant. How do I want to use it? Peter Drucker once said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And so we all have the chance to create that future. And the more people who embrace Bitcoin because they can see its environmental and social utility, that's basically a vote that this is going to mean that more of the technology is used in that way. So when you are owning Bitcoin, it's a statement. It's a vote for using it as a tool for freedom, for human justice, and for environmental justice.
Exactly. Well said. Well, Daniel, thanks a lot for taking the time, sharing all this information with us. And where can people find you?
On X is the best way at Batten. I also have a website, Batcoins, BATCOINZ, if you're in New Zealand, or Z if you're in the States.com. And my infrastructure investment company, which does the landfill gas mitigation using Bitcoin mining, is ch4capital.com.
Okay, great. Cool. Yeah. As I said, thanks a lot for sharing all this information with us. And enjoy the rest of your day. And hopefully see you in real life soon, sometime at a conference or so.
Look forward to it.
Thank you very much. Bye, Daniel.
See you later.